Good evening, everybody. I am the caboose of the lightning train. And I'm probably the last one now that stands between some harder alcohol and bigger plates as a meal. These are tough acts to follow, but I'm really going to talk about how and focus on how policy has created toxic inequality in the United States, and then really focus on what several of the lightning talks mentioned, that is the racial wealth gap in the United States. It's toxic inequality. This time, it's toxic. Inequality has always been with us and, unfortunately, always will be with us. What's different this time is that it's a combination. It's a combination of historic highs in both income and wealth inequality from the point at which we first have that data, combined with stagnating living standards and families struggling, families stalled in their ability to move ahead for themselves and their children, and racial discrimination. What we want to focus on, though, is, if you will, the last part of the feature for me of toxic inequality, the widening racial wealth gap. Race and wealth are at the center, and I would suggest have always been at the center of policy and inequality in the United States, going back to the first slave ships as codified in the Constitution and what makes a human being 3/5 of an individual. But let's level set a little bit and connect that history just for a moment or two to remember that African Americans were property in the United States, property that created tremendous wealth. Net wealth is everything of value that we as a family or as an individual owns, minus all of our debts, everything of value minus everything that we owe. And we start by asking, if you will, in terms of the racial wealth gap, what is the median black family wealth, that family smack in the middle of the distribution for African American families, and what that data tells us, it is about $17,000. For Hispanic families, it's a little bit more. It's about $20,000, closer to $21,000, and you can see those two figures sliding up on the slide presentation for you. For white families in the middle, again, half above, half below, median net wealth is about $171,000. Another way to think about that in terms of comparability is that average African American family has about a dime in wealth for every dollar of wealth that average or typical white family has. This evidence is from the latest representative surveys in the United States, not fake data. Indeed, in the several decades that I have been doing this work, we have never been challenged about the data. We do get challenged about the narrative about why that dime to a dollar comparison exists, and that's another very long story. We started to touch on narrative a little bit today. Again, it's not fake data. This story about the racial wealth gap has broken through into the public discourse, community organizing, and a bit into policy. And my good colleague at the second talk of the day talked about children's savings accounts. One feature, one part of the case building is their potential to narrow the racial wealth gap. The race and wealth story begins with history, slavery, Jim Crow, but it doesn't stop there. The gap actually widens. It worsens over time. The civil rights movement in the United States delivered some seriously important victories, hard-fought victories on the part of social movements, community organizing, civil rights, women's movements, and labor movements. But I would like to suggest, unfortunately, that the headwinds of racial stratification have stalled those legal victories, so that we have not seen the kinds of platforms for wealth accumulation for equity coming out of those movements of the 1960s. There's a lot of work to do ahead of us. The headwinds are not just things that blow in the ether, but rather they're those public institutions, racial stratification, policy that hardens the racial wealth gap and actually widens it. How do we know this? One way we know this, and it's some of the work that ISP and others have been doing in the last several years, is following the same set of families. The data I first gave, that dime on a dollar, the $17,000, $20,000, $171,000 for African American, Hispanic, typical white families, that's one slice in time. When we ask the question, what happens to families that we first started to follow in 1984, working age families at that point, and follow them for now 30 years, what happens to that racial wealth gap? Well, it's a story, and it's really not a great story to tell, but it's an important story for all of us to think about. We must think first about the same set of black families, and that's the first piece of data that we're putting up on the board, if you will. And I would like people to stop for a second and understand and think with me that there's a success story in that blue line. African American average wealth increased pretty sharply over 30 years for the same set of families as they aged. And as a sociologist, we know that one of the strongest associations with the growing of wealth is as one ages up until the latter part of one's working years. And so that rise in African American families, the same set of families from 4 to 17,000, is a success story. And we need to think about the reasons why that happened and applaud it. But that's not the whole story. Because what happens when we look at, not by a long shot, that's not the whole story. When we look at that same white family, 1984, and follow them through, look at that line. It's a line that I'm sure all of us wish every American family was on. But the distance between that white family and that African American family has increased threefold. Over the same period of time, white wealth amassed from $88,000 to $275,000. Again, a nice line, we wish everybody were there. To approach equity, wealth is not just bank, it's not just a dollar sign, but it really represents a family's ability to move ahead, our ability to care for our elderly parents, for those in our kinship and familial network and neighborhood networks around us, to survive emergencies in stride, not to have years of hard work thrown aside by a mishap, by a mistake, by an illness, by a car breaking its axle in winter and wiping it out. Wealth is far from just bank. In those senses, it represents opportunity, opportunity gained, opportunity lost, and I would suggest it represents a certain idea and notion of freedom that is important in the American context. So that gap, I guess the ladders are up there already, the gap that opened up at $84,000 in inflation-adjusted dollars, that is, the dollars buys the same amount year by year in there. In that same set of families, it opens up at $84,000. And as we march through American institutions, American policy, American neighborhoods, the way homes accumulate in value differently in different neighborhoods, that gap widens threefold to $258,000. How fortunes, well-being, human capacity has the ability to touch dreams so dramatically different by race is the key, I would suggest strongly, that shows us the needed transformations on the road to equity and racial justice. A large part of that difference, the accumulated difference that we just showed in that slide that animated for us, has to do with residential segregation. The next slide shows us a community called Ennis-Arden in the northern part of Seattle. Ennis-Arden is one of those developments first started in the 1940s that hardwired residential segregation, not by choice, but by government policy, developer greed, institutional bias, and private greed. Located in North Seattle, Ennis-Arden was developed to provide homes for the workers at the Boeing aircraft. In fact, the land was owned by William Boeing, one of the founders of that aircraft company that really grew it. But not all of Boeing's workforce or employees have the ability to live in Ennis-Arden. Let's see what restricted in that sign means here. A typical restrictive covenant attached to the title of all homes in Ennis-Arden community, restricted to the particular groups. And we also put in red whom else was allowed to be in that community: domestic servants. Get a double, if you will, a double oppression there. But that was yesterday, right? That's the 1940s, the 1950s. Surely over time, that kind of redlining and restrictive covenants have eroded with the winds of change and now are but part of a forgotten and no longer relevant bygone era. No. Today, the legacy of the embedded structures of inequality live in Ennis-Arden, and that's the zip code and the population of the zip code of Ennis-Arden as of the last census. African Americans, about 1% of the population there. Other ethnic and racial groups doing a bit better, but nowhere near the diversifying population and demographics of the city of Seattle, much less Native Americans. Seattle's not an outlier. The next slide is a map of New Orleans, a map that was drawn up to guide. Every city had apartheid maps from the United States government, official administration of the U.S. government, guiding banks on where to locate government-backed loans. Blue is good, red not so good. Redlining is the phrase, is the metaphor that came in with those maps. Not just Seattle, not just New Orleans, but literally in most cities. Redlining's midwife was government. Redlining's midwife was developer greed. The product, the child, if you will, is residential segregation that is existing long past those maps. Redlining is more than a term. It's leaders mapping residential apartheid. And as we know, homes are by far the largest component of wealth for most, that is, typical American families. In fact, for about 2/3 of America's families, the home equity, the amount of net wealth a family owns, is in the form of their home. But wealth is needed to buy a home in the first place. So that historical legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, the Homestead Acts, which was referred to, land-grant colleges, which groups leaders allowed to own property and where they were allowed to own property, and which groups were denied property ownership and financial participation. That's history, marching right up into the present. Residential segregation, in what I think is one of the classic lines of my sociology era, residential segregation is the linchpin of racial stratification. A lot of racialized work goes into home ownership in communities. Who acquires homes? Through family inheritance, government backing, inclusive welcoming, neighbor resistance in some cases, realtor steering. That's a story of racial stratification, allocating by location advantages and disadvantages. I need to give a quick shout out to one other part of the racial wealth gap, and that is the missing part of the connection between work and wealth. And what stands right in the middle that is often missing for most workers is workplace-based retirement or savings plans. The work that we have done at ISP and others are now documenting how access to workplace savings plans for workers, where it exists, is miserly, and it mirrors occupational segregation in the United States. What we usually leave out of thinking about work, and even $15 an hour, a great campaign, but what's missing there are the benefits. Retirement plan, paid sick leave, paid maternity or paternity leave, dependent care, child care, helping to save for children's education. The challenges and anti-racist transformations needed are not new, and they're not easy. It's very hard work. And I see a lot of friends out there. We're the, if you will, the band coming back together every couple of years. Next couple of years, I hope that band has tunes that will allow us to sing in a rousing chorus the successes that we've had. Now, let's map it out and let's move forward together. Thank you.